A wet clump of dirt hit me right beside my husband's grave, and my daughter-in-law was the one laughing as it covered my face. I wiped the mud from my eyes, swallowed the pain in my knees, and stayed silent. They thought I was weak. They thought I was just a 62-year-old widow they could bury alive. They did not know that by morning, that dirt would be evidence, and she would be regretting everything in handcuffs. My name is Eleanor Briggs. At 62 years old, I should have been the doting grandmother sitting at the head of the table, carving the turkey and handing out envelopes of cash to grateful relatives. Instead, I stood in the archway of my son's dining room in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, looking like a spectre that had crawled out of a fresh grave to haunt the living. I leaned heavily on my cane, not because I physically could not walk without it, but because I wanted them to see it. The bruise under my left eye had ripened into a dark purple welt, a violent souvenir from the concrete edge of a burial plot. But it was my shoes that drew the most attention. They were expensive black leather loafers, the kind I used to wear to church. But today they were caked with the dry, grey mud from the cemetery. I had forbidden myself from cleaning them. I wanted the dirt of my husband's final resting place to be the first thing they saw this Christmas morning. The room had been loud with the clatter of silverware and the tearing of wrapping paper. My son, Dylan, was laughing at something his wife, Kayla, had said. But as I stepped onto the plush carpet, the laughter died in their throats. The silence that followed was absolute. I limp-walked to the empty chair at the end of the table, the rhythmic tap of my cane against the floorboards the only sound in the room. I did not sit. I looked at the festive spread of bacon, eggs, and waffles, then raised my eyes to meet Kayla's gaze. Yesterday, at the cemetery, Kayla deliberately threw a shovel full of dirt onto me, I said. My voice was calm, flat and factual, as if I were simply announcing that we were out of milk. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My niece stopped chewing. My brother-in-law put down his coffee mug. All eyes turned to Dylan, my son, my only child, let out a short, sharp scoff. He smirked, leaning back in his chair with a casual arrogance that made my stomach turn. "Oh, come on, Mum," Dylan said, waving his fork in the air dismissively. "You are still alive, are you not? Just consider it a little lesson in gravity. You should not have been standing so close to the edge." The cruelty of his words sent a ripple of shock through the extended family. But he tried to play it off as a rough, masculine joke. Kayla, impeccable in her red cashmere sweater and diamonds that I had paid for, widened her blue eyes in feigned distress. She turned to the aunts and cousins, her hand fluttering to her chest like a wounded bird. "Oh, please," Kayla said, her voice trembling with a manufactured innocence. "It was a terrible accident. She is confused. Eleanor tripped over the pile of earth. I tried to catch her. Really, I did. I did not argue. I did not scream. I simply reached into the pocket of my oversized cardigan and withdrew a small, digital voice recorder. I placed it gently on the table, right next to a platter of syrup-drenched pancakes. With a steady finger, I pressed the play button. The audio was crystal clear. It had been recorded inside their luxury SUV late last night, while I lay awake in the guest room they had graciously allowed me to occupy. "Did you see her face when the mud hit?" Kayla's voice rang out from the tiny speaker, high and shrill with amusement. "I thought I buried the old woman right there. God, that was satisfying. She looked like a swamp monster." Dylan's voice followed, deep and mocking. Maybe next time she will stay down. The recording ended. The silence returned. But this time it was different. It was terrified. My cousin stared at Dylan as if he were a stranger. Kayla's face drained of all colour, leaving her makeup looking like a mask on a corpse. I watched them, and in my mind, I replayed the last 2 months. They thought I was senile. They thought I was helpless. They had no idea that while they plotted, I had been rewriting my will. I had been meeting with private investigators. I had been on the phone with my lawyer, Harold Grant, until 3 a.m. Kayla's eyes darted from the recorder to me. Realization dawned on her face. She lunged across the table, her manicured claws reaching for the device. I was faster. I slammed my hand down over it, my grip iron hard. "Do not be in such a hurry. Kayla," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "There is plenty more where that came from. I have copies on my computer. I have copies in the cloud. And the police will be here before you manage to wash that dirt off your hands." For a second, I let myself feel the weight of the moment. I admitted to myself that I was not always this cold. Just 1 year ago, I was a weeping, soft-hearted widow who believed her son was her savior. I had handed them the keys to my kingdom because I was lonely, but that Eleanor Briggs was gone. The woman standing here now was forged in betrayal. The doorbell rang. It was a long, insistent peal that shattered the tension. I glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, right on time. I looked at Dylan, who was now trembling, and offered him a thin, cold smile. The door was about to open, and their world was about to end. "My name is Eleanor Briggs. I am 62 years old, a woman with pale skin that wrinkles a little more each year, and a spine stiffened by the cold winters of the Midwest where I grew up. I currently reside in Willow Creek, a town that feels both too big and too small, depending on the day. Before the mud and the betrayal, my life was defined by 35 years of an unshakable marriage to Marshall Briggs. Marshall was a man who spoke little, but did much. Together, we built Briggs Haven from the ground up. It started as a single, dusty lot for RV parking and grew into a chain of storage facilities and vehicle depots that stretched across the state. I can still feel the gravel crunching under our boots during those early morning inspections. Marshall and I would wake up before the sun, thermoses of black coffee in hand, to walk the perimeter of our lots. We checked fences, oiled gate hinges, and counted spaces. At night, we would sit at our kitchen table, tired but content, calculating the costs for opening a new branch in Fairmont. We cheered over every percentage point of growth in our revenue. That wealth was not just money to us. It was the physical manifestation of our sweat, our arguments, and our shared dreams. It was the legacy we planned to leave behind. Dylan was the center of that legacy. He was our only son. I have such vivid memories of him as a boy. His face smudged with grease as he helped his father fix bicycles in the garage. He used to look at Marshall with such adoration. He grew up, went to college, and landed a respectable job at a logistics company called Northline Freight. He was a good man, or so I believed. He had always promised that he would never let me be alone when I got old. I held on to that promise like a lifeline. Then he brought Kayla home. She was a former sales associate, a young woman with blonde hair and a smile that could light up a room on command. She was chatty and vibrant, a stark contrast to our quiet household. She knew exactly when to laugh at Marshall's dry jokes, and she never arrived without a box of pastries or a homemade pie. I was charmed. I had always wanted a daughter, and Kayla seemed to fit that empty space in my heart perfectly. I thought she was a blessing. Everything changed on a Tuesday in November. Marshall suffered a massive stroke in the parking lot of our Riverbend branch. By the time I arrived, the ambulance was already there, its red lights spinning frantically against the grey sky. I stood there in shock, my hands still stained with oil from working in the garden, unable to say a single word of goodbye. He was gone before he hit the pavement. The silence he left behind was deafening. At the funeral, I felt like I was drowning. That was when Kayla stepped in. She stood right beside me at the casket, holding me tighter than anyone else. She whispered comforting words, telling me that they were there for me. Dylan stood on my other side, looking solemn and dependable. He looked me in the eye and promised to take care of me just as his father had done. That promise was the only thing that kept me standing that day. It was the reason I lowered every single one of my defenses. In the weeks that followed, our 2-story house in Willow Creek became a tomb. The silence was absolute. I could hear the refrigerator humming from the other room. Dinner became a solitary ritual with a single plate on the table. The loneliness was a physical weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It made me soft. It made me desperate for any sign of life. Dylan and Kayla began to visit more frequently. They brought dinner. They filled the empty air with noise. They suggested renovating the kitchen to cheer me up. They talked about how families should live close together to support one another. I felt like I was being pulled back from the edge of an abyss. I thought they were saving me from my grief. I did not realize that they were simply moving into position. The final step of my surrender happened in the office of Harold Grant, our family attorney. Dylan sat next to me, looking concerned and responsible. He suggested that he could help manage the day-to-day operations of Briggs Haven so I could rest. He said I had done enough work for one lifetime. It sounded so reasonable. It sounded like love. I picked up the pen and signed the temporary power of attorney, granting him access to the business accounts. I thought I was doing the wise thing. I thought I was protecting what Marshall and I had built. I did not know that with that single signature. I had handed the keys to the vault to the very people who were planning to rob me blind. It began with a lie about temporary necessity. Dylan and Kayla moved into my house under the pretense of looking for a place of their own, bringing with them a few suitcases that quickly multiplied into a full-scale invasion. At first, they only occupied the guest bedroom, but their presence expanded like a slow-moving gas. Dylan's heavy winter coat appeared on the hook in the hallway, pushing aside the flannel jacket Marshall had worn for 20 years. Kayla's high heels were kicked off by the back door, taking the spot where my gardening clogs had always lived. It was a physical colonization of my space, subtle at first, but soon undeniable. Then came the suggestions to refresh the house. Kayla claimed the heavy velvet curtains and dark wood furniture were making me depressed. She said I needed light and air to heal. Before I could truly object, she had ordered sheer drapes and a beige modern sofa that looked like it belonged in a dentist's waiting room. She started boxing up Marshall's things, his fishing trophies, his collection of vintage oil cans from the garage, insisting that putting them away would help me move on. To me, it felt like she was stripping the skin off my life. Every box she taped shut was a piece of my history being silenced. But I let her do it, because I thought she was trying to save me from my grief. The financial requests started shortly after the furniture arrived. Dylan came to me one evening. his face etched with worry. He told me that Northline Freight was downsizing and that his job was on the line. He needed $30,000 to enroll in a senior management training course that would guarantee his position. I did not hesitate. I wrote the check immediately. He was my son, and his stability was my priority. A week later, Kayla sat beside me on that new beige sofa, dabbing at her red-rimmed eyes. She told me her parents in another state were drowning in medical debt and were at risk of losing their home. She needed $20,000. Again. I opened the checkbook. I told her that family helps family, and I truly believed that was what we were doing. But the emergency requests soon morphed into a routine. It was $5,000 for a cryptocurrency investment Dylan was sure about. Then it was $12,000 for a deposit on a future house for the grandchildren I hoped to have. Then $8,000 to repair a car accident that insurance somehow refused to cover. The money left my accounts in steady streams, but not a single cent ever found its way back. Whenever I gently mentioned a repayment plan, Dylan would wrap me in a bear hug and tell me to just wait a little longer, that they were moving funds around. Kayla would jump in, offering to take over the electric and water bills as a gesture of responsibility. It seemed like a fair compromise at the time, but I was trading thousands for pennies. I started to notice the timing of these requests. They never asked for money when the house was full of people. They never asked when I was feeling strong or cheerful. They waited until the house was quiet, or worse. They waited until I had just finished crying over a photograph of Marshall. Kayla was a master at this. She would bring up a fond memory of my husband, wait for my defenses to crumble, and then slide a contract or an iPad across the table for a signature. I was signing away my assets through a veil of tears. The atmosphere in the house shifted completely. It no longer felt like the home Marshall and I had built. It felt like a shared dormitory where I was the unpopular roommate. I found myself asking for permission to invite my bridge club over, only to be told by Kayla that the house was too messy and she needed time to clean it first. My friends stopped calling. I was being isolated in my own living room. One afternoon, the reality of my situation struck me with the force of a physical blow. I was in the kitchen making tea, and Kayla was leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, half smiling, and said in a voice that was part joke and part prayer, that one day when Briggs Haven belonged to them completely, they would not even have to work anymore. I laughed awkwardly, but a cold spark of unease ignited in my gut. For the first time, I wondered if they were simply waiting for me to die. It was a Tuesday night when the last remnants of my naivety were washed away by the rain. A relentless storm was battering Willow Creek, drumming against the roof with a rhythm that made sleep impossible. I lay in bed until 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling, before deciding to go downstairs to brew a pot of chamomile tea. The house was dark and cold. As I passed the kitchen, I noticed a faint sliver of light beneath the door leading to the attached garage. I paused, my hand hovering over the light switch. Muffled voices drifted through the wood. Dylan and Kayla were sitting in their car with the engine off, but the windows down, likely seeking a private place to talk away from the thin walls of the guest room. I stepped closer, intending to let them know I was awake, but Kayla's voice froze me in place. "How much longer is your mother going to hang on?" Kayla asked. Her tone was impatient, stripped of the sugary sweetness she used whenever she wanted a check. "She is 62 years old, but she is tough. She looks like she could live another 20 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. My hand trembled so violently that the porcelain cup I was holding rattled against its saucer. I pressed it against my chest to silence it, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I waited for Dylan to defend me. I waited for my son to tell her to stop speaking about his mother, like she was an expired carton of milk. If it were not for Briggs Haven, I would not even look at her face. Dylan replied. There was a hesitation in his voice, but then he let out a dry, hollow laugh. But we have to endure it. The money is worth the wait. He spoke about me as if I were a stock portfolio he was waiting to vest. I felt the bile rise in my throat. We need to speed this up, Kayla continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried clearly in the garage's acoustics. We use the power of attorney to transfer the liquid assets into a joint account. Then we take her to Dr. Hale. We get a diagnosis. We put her in the Silver Phase Care Center at Golden Pines. I gasped silently. Golden Pines was a nursing home on the edge of town, notorious for its smell of bleach and urine, a place where families dropped off their burdens and never looked back. She is practically senile already, Kayla said, and I could hear the smirk in her voice. She does not even remember what day of the week it is half the time. The court will believe us. They will grant you full guardianship. Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast. They were not tears of fear. They were tears of absolute clarity. I finally understood that I was not a person to them. I was an obstacle between them and the fortune Marshall and I had built with our bare hands. And if the court drags its feet, Kayla added, her voice turning icy. We can always try a more extreme option. A few extra doses of her blood pressure medication in her morning juice. It would look like a natural stroke. The silence that followed was heavy. I prayed for Dylan to scream, to slap her, to tell her she was insane. Do not talk about things like that here, Dylan said finally. The neighbors have cameras pointing at the driveway. We cannot risk it. He did not object to the murder of his mother. He only objected to the possibility of getting caught. I slowly backed away into the shadows of the hallway. I climbed the stairs with the stealth of a ghost, my bad knee screaming in protest. But I felt nothing. I entered my bedroom and turned the lock on the door for the first time since Marshall had died. I sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the framed photograph of my husband from the nightstand. The Eleanor who had opened her home and her checkbook was dead. She had died in that kitchen hallway. I wiped my face. My hands were steady now. In the midst of the horror, I realized I had one advantage. They thought I was weak. They thought I was losing my mind. If they wanted a senile old woman, I would give them one. I would play the part of the confused, helpless widow while I sharpened my knife. I looked at Marshall's smiling face in the glass and made a silent vow. I would not cry for Dylan again. I would not beg for the love of a son who did not exist. Instead, I would clean up the dirt they had thrown on the Briggs name. I would let them think they were burying me, right up until the moment I pulled them into the grave they had dug for themselves. I told Dylan and Kayla I was going to the outlet mall to look for Christmas gifts, but instead, I drove straight to the Fairmont branch of Briggs Haven to meet with Miriam Cole. Miriam had been our accountant for 20 years, a woman who treated a balance sheet with the reverence of a holy text. Before I walked into her office, I slipped my spare smartphone into the breast pocket of my coat with the voice memo app recording. I needed a record of everything. I sat down and told her I wanted to review the year-end files, but my tone told her this was not a routine visit. Miriam opened the digital ledger, and the screen bled red. She pointed out a series of unauthorized withdrawals, each one ranging from $2,000 to $4,000. They were small enough to avoid immediate alarms, but frequent enough to be catastrophic. I cross-referenced the dates in my head. Every single withdrawal coincided with a Tuesday or Thursday morning. The exact times I was either at my physical therapy appointments or attending my book club. In total, nearly $90,000 had vanished from the business operating accounts in just 6 months. That was only the beginning. Miriam pulled up a separate folder labeled Family Loans. The figure at the bottom of the page made my breath catch in my throat. The loans to Dylan and Kayla had reached $160,000. There was no repayment schedule. There were no interest rates. There was not even a properly drafted contract. There were just handwritten notes scrawled on napkins or scrap paper, labeled as family support, accompanied by my signature, which looked shaky and weak. I stared at the ink, remembering how they would hand me these papers when I was groggy from medication or blinded by tears. I looked Miriam in the eye and gave her a direct order. I told her to revoke Dylan's access to all Briggs Haven accounts immediately and to cancel his digital signature authorization. I asked her to print a hard copy of every suspicious transaction. Miriam did not ask why. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound respect. She realized that the grieving widow was gone and the businesswoman had returned. 2 days later, I met Andre Lewis at a secluded diner on the outskirts of town. Andre was a former police detective from Lakeford who now worked as a private investigator. He slid into the booth opposite me, looking tired but sharp. He placed a manila folder on the table but did not let go of it. He asked me if I was truly ready to face the facts if my son was involved. I told him clearly that I was not paying him to protect my illusions. Andre opened the file. He had tailed Kayla for 3 days. It turned out my daughter-in-law was maintaining a small studio apartment in Rivergate, a city 2 hours away. She was not using it for an affair, but for business. Andre had photographed her meeting with a man named Victor Hale. I knew the name. Hale was a lawyer who specialized in elder law, specifically in aggressive guardianship cases where children took control of their parents' estates. But the dirt Andre found went deeper than secret meetings. He had dug into public records from Texas. 10 years ago, Kayla had been married to a 70-year-old man who owned a chain of furniture stores. They had been married for only 18 months when he died after falling down a flight of stairs in their home. It was ruled an accident. Kayla inherited a significant sum, sold the business, changed her last name, and moved 2 states away. She had absolutely no contact with her late husband's family, who had tried and failed to contest the will. Andre then slid a printout of intercepted emails across the table. They were exchanges between Kayla and Victor Hale. She did not use my name, but she asked detailed questions about how to document a decline in mental capacity. She described an estate consisting of lucrative parking lots and storage units. She asked how quickly a temporary guardianship could be made permanent if the subject suffered a medical emergency. I sat in my car in the parking lot of Briggs Haven later that afternoon, the engine idling. I held the folder Andre had given me and replayed the audio from my pocket recorder. I listened to the numbers Miriam had given me. $90,000 stolen, $160,000 borrowed. I thought about the man in Texas who fell down the stairs. The picture was complete. I was not just dealing with a greedy daughter-in-law. I was living with a predator who had hunted before, and she had already decided that I was her next kill. I returned home that evening and walked through the front door as if nothing had changed. I cooked dinner. I asked Dylan about his day at work, and I let Kayla choose the television program, But inside, my mind was a whirlwind of strategy. If they wanted to paint me as senile, I would provide them with the paint, but I would choose the colors. I began a campaign of calculated confusion. I would purposefully ask Kayla what time a specific movie started, then ask again 10 minutes later, and then a third time. I saw the annoyance flash in her eyes, but I also saw the satisfaction. She would complain loudly to Dylan that Mom is forgetting things again, making sure her voice carried to the neighbors. I would call the laundry detergent by the wrong name, or pretend to lose my glasses while they were sitting on my head. I kept a secret notebook hidden beneath the floorboards of my closet, documenting every instance where I played dumb and recording their reactions. While they were busy mocking me, I was busy fortifying my fortress. I purchased several high-definition mini-cameras with cloud storage capabilities. I waited until they were out of the house. Then I installed them meticulously. One went into the potted plant in the living room. Another was hidden behind the books on the hallway shelf. The most important one was concealed in the recess of the outdoor light fixture in the backyard, overlooking the spot where Dylan had contractors digging up the foundation for a new garage he claimed we needed. I watched Kayla bring friends over when I was napping. She would recount stories of my forgetfulness, laughing as she showed them videos she had secretly filmed of me looking for my keys. But my camera on the bookshelf was recording her, capturing the moment she texted those videos to Victor Hale with the caption, "Great material for the file." Dylan began bringing home stacks of paperwork, telling me they were routine lease renewals for the parking lots. I feigned a tremor in my hand, signing my name crookedly on purpose. I would look up at him with wide, innocent eyes and ask, "Do I still have to go to work if I give everything to you, son?" He would smile that shark-like smile and tell me not to worry. He thought he was taking control. In reality, I was feeding his overconfidence. Behind the scenes, I made my most critical move. I visited Harold Grant again and executed a new will. I left the entirety of the Briggs Haven estate to the Open Roads Foundation, a charity Marshall and I had supported, and to a distant niece in Oregon. I left Dylan a sum of money so small it was insulting, just enough to prevent him from contesting the will on the grounds that I had forgotten him. I also signed a durable medical power of attorney, appointing my oldest friend, Lynn Parker, as the sole decision-maker for my health. If Dylan tried to commit me to Golden Pines, he would hit a legal wall of reinforced steel. The trap was set. When Kayla mentioned that a friend had recommended a neurologist to check my memory, I agreed with a sigh of resignation. I let them think I was walking willingly into their cage. I stood in the backyard one evening, looking at the gaping hole the workmen had dug for the garage. I touched the hidden camera in the light fixture and knew, with a chilling certainty, that this hole would soon be the scene of Kayla's biggest mistake. The day we committed Marshall's ashes to the earth at Ridgeview Hill was painted in shades of grey. The sky was a heavy sheet of slate, and a biting wind whipped through the bare trees, stinging my cheeks. A small group of family and close friends gathered around the small, square hole in the ground. To the side, the groundskeepers had left a mound of wet, heavy brown dirt, ready to seal the grave once we had said our goodbyes. I moved slowly, favouring my left leg, my hand gripping the handle of my cane tightly. My lower back throbbed with a dull ache, a reminder of the stress I had been carrying for months. I stepped forward and placed a single white rose on top of the urn, whispering a final goodbye to the man who had been my world. As I turned to step back, Kayla was suddenly at my side. She hooked her arm through mine, her grip firm and controlling under the guise of support. She whispered that she wanted to help me step over to the paved path where it was safer. I let her guide me, playing the part of the frail widow. As the other mourners turned away to comfort one another, I felt Kayla release my arm. She took a step back toward the mound of earth. I saw her hand reach out and grab the handle of a spade that had been left leaning against a headstone. She feigned a stumble, a theatrical lurch to the side, but her movements were too precise to be an accident. With a sudden, violent grunt of effort, she drove the spade into the loose soil and heaved a heavy, wet mass of dirt directly at me. The impact knocked the wind out of me. The cold, damp earth slammed into my chest and face, blinding me instantly. I lost my balance and fell backward, my left knee smashing against the concrete edge of the burial plot with a sickening crack. I lay there, gasping for air, mud filling my mouth and coating my hair. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard a low, soft laugh right beside my head. "Oh God, you have to look at your face," Kayla whispered, her voice dripping with amusement. "You look exactly like you just crawled out of a grave." She thought her words were buried under the sound of the wind, but she did not know about the tiny button camera pinned to my coat collar, a piece of technology Andre had insisted I wear. It captured every syllable. I expected my son to rush to my aid. I expected outrage. Instead, Dylan jogged over, looking annoyed rather than worried. He did not offer me a hand. He stood over me, shaking his head, and scolded me in front of everyone. He told me loudly that he had warned me not to stand so close to the edge. He said I needed to listen to them next time. His voice was full of reprimand, treating me like a disobedient child or a senile burden. He made it clear to everyone watching that my fall was a result of my own incompetence. The guests gasped and rushed to help, believing it was a terrible accident. I let them wipe the mud from my eyes. I felt the grit between my teeth and the cold seepage of water through my clothes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to point a muddy finger at Kayla and scream that she had attacked me. But I swallowed the rage. I bit my tongue until I tasted iron. I needed them to believe they had won. I needed to remain the perfect victim for just one more day. Later that afternoon, back at the house, I sat in the living room with an ice pack strapped to my swelling knee. My back was screaming in pain. From the kitchen, I heard Kayla's voice. She was on speakerphone with a friend, recounting the events of the funeral. She was laughing hysterically, describing how I had fallen flat on my face. She called it the highlight of the day. The camera I had hidden in the hallway light fixture recorded her cruel joy, adding another layer to the mountain of evidence I was building. That night, when the house was finally silent and they assumed I was asleep in my room, I opened my laptop. I accessed the secure cloud server where the footage was stored. I watched the video from the cemetery again. Andre had placed a portable camera on a nearby lamppost earlier that morning. The angle was perfect. I played the clip in slow motion. It was undeniable. Kayla did not stumble. She planted her feet, gripped the shovel, and swung it with malicious intent. It was not an accident. It was assault. I closed the laptop and looked down at my bruised knee. I ran my fingers over the dried smear of dirt still clinging to the lapel of my coat. I did not wash it off. I whispered into the dark room. "All right. Kayla, you chose dirt as your weapon. I will use it to bury everything you are greedy for." The house was finally silent, settled into the heavy stillness of a winter night. But I was wide awake. As soon as I heard the rhythmic snoring of my son and daughter-in-law drifting from the guest room, I locked my bedroom door and dialed Harold Grant. My hands were steady as I hit send on the encrypted email, attaching the high-definition video of the incident at the cemetery, along with the financial logs Miriam had printed and the surveillance footage from inside the house. Harold answered on the first ring. He did not speak for a long time after opening the files. I could hear the clicking of his mouse and the sharp intake of his breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. He told me that I had given him more than enough to open a major criminal case. He said he was contacting the district attorney immediately to file an emergency motion. We were going to freeze the Briggs Haven accounts first thing in the morning. Every credit card, every bank transfer, every signature authority associated with Dylan and Kayla would be locked down before they could pour their coffee. I needed one last piece of the puzzle. At 2 a.m, I slipped out the back door, careful to avoid the squeaky floorboard in the hallway. I drove my car to the rear parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store 3 miles away. Andre was waiting for me in his sedan, the engine running to keep the heater on. He handed me a small flash drive and played a snippet of audio on his phone. It was a recording of a call Kayla had made to Victor Hale just hours ago. The old hag went down hard. Kayla's voice sneered through the speaker. Right in front of the whole family. It was perfect. Everyone thinks she is clumsy and losing her balance. This is exactly the kind of physical decline we need for the competency hearing. Andre looked at me in the dim light of the dashboard. He told me that her arrogance was going to be her undoing. That recording proved the fall was not just a prank, but a calculated step in a conspiracy to defraud. We finalized the plan with Harold over speakerphone. The police were scheduled to arrive at my house at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. Dylan and Kayla had organized a big Christmas breakfast, inviting aunts, uncles, and several of Kayla's friends. They wanted a large audience to witness my frailty. Harold told me that was perfect. We would give them an audience, but they would be watching a very different show. You have to play the part one last time. Eleanor, Harold instructed. Walk in there looking tired. Let them control the narrative about the accident. Let them lie to everyone. Then, you drop the hammer. He told me to bring 2 things to the table. First, the pocket recorder I had been using. Second, a USB drive containing the compilation of videos from the backyard, the hallway, and the cemetery, along with copies of the emails between Kayla and Victor. He reminded me that the large television in the kitchen had a USB port on the side. That screen would be my witness stand. I did not sleep a wink that night. I sat in the armchair in the living room, the room that used to smell like Marshall's pipe tobacco, but now smelled of Kayla's cloying perfume. I put my headphones on and listened to the recordings again. I heard Dylan laughing about my lesson in gravity. I heard Kayla asking how long I would last. Each cruel word was like a log thrown onto a fire inside me, burning away the grief and leaving only a cold, hard resolve. Around midnight, there was a soft knock at the door. Dylan peeked in, his face a mask of concern. He asked if my knee was hurting. He told me they were planning a small memorial breakfast for Dad in the morning and that he hoped I would be up for it. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. He said it was good that we were all together in our house. I forced a tremulous smile and thanked him. I waited until he closed the door before I let the expression drop. It was not his house. It never would be. Ever? As the sky outside the window began to turn a bruised purple with the coming dawn, I stood up. The pain in my knee was sharp, but I ignored it. I went to the closet and chose a simple grey sweater and black trousers. I slid the voice recorder into my pocket and gripped the USB drive in my hand like a grenade. I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the victim who had been covered in dirt yesterday. She was a soldier going to war. I was ready to take back my name, and I was going to do it while they were still eating their pancakes. The morning sun streamed through the windows of my son's dining room, illuminating a scene that looked like a spread from a holiday magazine. The house was packed. Kayla's mother was there, along with a few of their stylish friends, and my cousin Fred, who had driven in from the next town. The table groaned under the weight of crispy bacon, scrambled eggs, and stacks of waffles. Kayla was fluttering around like the lady of the manor, directing people where to sit and instructing them to place their gifts under the tree. She looked radiant, completely at ease in a home she had already decided was hers. I walked into the room, making sure to emphasize the limp in my left leg. The bruise on my knee throbbed in time with my heartbeat, but my face remained a mask of polite exhaustion. As I entered, I heard Kayla's voice rising above the chatter. She was retelling the story of the funeral to her mother and friends, describing the unfortunate little accident at the cemetery with a tone of pity that barely concealed her mockery. She was painting a picture of a clumsy, failing old woman who could no longer be trusted to walk on her own 2 feet. I cleared my throat. The room quieted slightly. I looked at her and said, calmly but with absolute clarity, that I had not fallen. I told them that someone had deliberately pushed a shovel full of dirt onto me. Dylan laughed. It was a sharp, dismissive sound. He cut me off immediately, shaking his head as he buttered his toast. He told everyone that it was just a slip, a sad result of my age. And then he looked at me with false sympathy and said I was imagining things again. Several guests nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with that patronizing understanding people reserve for the elderly. They believed the young, vibrant couple. I did not argue. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out the digital recorder. I set it on the table next to the sugar bowl and pressed play. The volume was turned up to the maximum. Kayla's voice filled the room, shrill and cruel. The old hag went down hard, right in front of the whole family. It was perfect. Everyone thinks she is clumsy and losing her balance. The silence that followed was instant and total. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Eyes widened. Everyone turned to look at Kayla. She froze, her smile faltering. She let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh and tried to wave it off. She told them it was just a bad joke, something said in a moment of stress. She looked around the table, begging them to believe her with her eyes. But the air in the room had shifted. The hostility was palpable. Sensing she was losing her audience, Kayla's face twisted into a scowl. She turned on me, her voice rising to a shout. She said that if I had just agreed to hand over Briggs Haven to them, they would not have had to think of ways to protect my assets for me. She had said it. She had admitted the motive in front of a dozen witnesses, right on cue. The doorbell rang. It was a crisp, authoritative sound. I stood up, ignoring the pain in my leg, and told everyone to please continue eating. I walked to the door and opened it. 2 uniformed police officers stood there, flanked by Andre Lewis and my lawyer, Harold Grant. I stepped back and invited them in, then turned to the stunned room and introduced them as the people who would hear the rest of the story. Harold walked straight to the large television mounted on the kitchen wall. He plugged in the USB drive without a word. The screen flickered to life. The first clip showed Dylan and Kayla in the backyard, discussing how they would be debt-free once I was locked away in Golden Pines. Then came footage of a party in the Rivergate apartment, with champagne bottles bought with my company's money. Then came the finale. The video from the cemetery played. It showed the scene from two angles, one from my collar, one from the lamppost. It was undeniable. The guests watched in horror as Kayla planted her feet, swung the shovel with all her might, and buried me in dirt. The camera zoomed in on her face. There was no panic. There was only a satisfied, vicious smirk. My cousin Fred stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Kayla's mother burst into tears, covering her mouth with her hand and asking her daughter what she had done. Dylan sat frozen, his eyes glued to the screen. Then the audio from the video played, capturing his own voice saying that if the old woman broke her back, it would be easier to get guardianship. He started to shake. The police officers stepped forward. They read the rights to Dylan and Kayla in front of the entire family. They listed the temporary charges: aggravated assault on an elderly person, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. Kayla started screaming that I was making it all up, that it was a setup, but the image of her swinging that shovel played on a loop on the television behind her, silencing every lie she tried to tell. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, a cold, metallic sound that signaled the end of her performance. That same afternoon, I sat in a sterile interview room at the county police station, flanked by Harold and Andre. The prosecutor reviewed our evidence with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for a case this watertight all year. He immediately filed a motion for an emergency restraining order, barring Dylan and Kayla from coming within 500 feet of me or any Briggs Haven property. By the time the sun went down, the legal wall between me and my predators was built. The emergency hearing took place early the next morning. I sat across the aisle from my son and daughter-in-law. They were no longer the confident couple sipping champagne in a luxury apartment. They were wearing bright orange jumpsuits, and their wrists were still marked with red indentations from the handcuffs. I looked at them and remembered my promise to myself. By morning, they would regret everything. They looked terrified. Victor Hale, the lawyer Kayla had consulted, was called to the stand. Facing aggressive questioning from the prosecutor and realizing he was at risk of losing his license, he turned on his client instantly. He admitted that Kayla had explicitly discussed fabricating evidence of my mental decline to secure a guardianship. To save his own skin, he submitted a chain of emails where Kayla bragged that the money from this scheme would come even faster than it had with her previous husband in Texas. The courtroom gasped. The predator had been unmasked. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the list of temporary charges aloud: fraud, elder abuse, aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit theft. Each charge carried the weight of a potential prison sentence. Kayla's face went the color of chalk. Dylan hung his head low, staring at his shackled hands. For the first time, I heard him mumble a weak apology, but his voice was as flimsy as his defense. Dylan's public defender tried to paint a picture of a naive husband manipulated by a sociopathic wife. He argued that Dylan was a victim too, a man led astray by love. I was asked to clarify my statement. I looked directly at the judge and recounted the moment I fell into the grave. I told him clearly that my son did not rush to help me. I told him that my son laughed. I repeated Dylan's words about it being a lesson in gravity. That detail shattered the victim narrative completely. A man who laughs at his mother's pain is not a victim. He is an accomplice. The gavel came down with a finality that rang in my bones. The judge denied bail for Kayla, citing her history of changing identities and crossing state lines as a significant flight risk. For Dylan, bail was set at a figure so high he could never pay it, especially since I had frozen every asset he had access to. They were remanded to the county jail to await trial. After the hearing, Harold and I signed a mountain of paperwork. We solidified my will, ensuring that not a single penny would ever go to them. We transferred the temporary management of Briggs Haven to an independent board of directors to shield the company from future litigation. We also filed a civil suit to classify the $160,000 they had stolen as a formal debt, ensuring they would be paying me back for the rest of their lives. As the bailiffs were leading them away, Dylan asked for a moment to speak to me. The guard allowed it, just for a minute, in the cold, fluorescent light of the hallway. He was crying now, real tears this time, streaming down his face. He started to blame Kayla, saying she made him do it, that he loved me. I looked at the boy I had raised, the man who had chosen money over my life. You had a choice when the dirt hit my face, Dylan, I said softly. You chose to stand with her. The court might eventually reduce your sentence, but my heart has already sentenced you to life without me. I turned my back on him and walked out into the crisp winter air. I returned to the empty house in Willow Creek. It was quiet, but it was a peaceful silence, not a lonely one. I took the muddy shoes out of the closet. I sat on the back porch and carefully scraped away the dried grey earth, watching it fall into the garden. I placed the clean shoes back in the box. Then I opened the window and took a deep breath. The air was cold and sharp. I knew there would be trials ahead. There would be reporters and endless forms to sign. But the knot in my chest was gone. I was no longer living with a monster named Briggs. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened a fresh notebook. I picked up a pen and wrote the first entry of my new life. If someone throws dirt on your life, let them think you are buried. Then, from beneath that soil, calmly build a courthouse designed just for them. I closed the book and looked out at the distant lights of the Briggs Haven lot. The rest of my life belonged to me, and I was going to live every second of it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's chat. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people.